Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to start on our first physiological system, and we're going to look at part of the digestive system, and we'll finish that up tomorrow. So think back and remember, what is the goal of the digestive system? If you said it is break down the food into building block molecules that then can be absorbed into the bloodstream or into the body, give yourself a big pat on the back because that's correct. So let's see how all this works. The digestive system, as we said, provides nutrients for cells, and the goal is to turn food into building block molecules, and those building block molecules, you remember, are things like amino acids, which comprise proteins, fatty acids, which make up lipids, simple sugars, which make up complex carbohydrates, and nucleotides, which make up DNA and RNA. There are two ways that the digestive system does this. One is by mechanical breakdown, physically breaking the food into smaller pieces. So why would you want to do that? Well, you increase the surface area when you do that. So why do you want to increase the surface area? For chemical digestion, which is the second method of turning food into building block molecules. So chemical digestion is the breaking down of the large macromolecules in the food into the building block molecules, and that's done by enzymes. And so the more surface area of the food means the more substrate that is available for the enzymes. Now, the flow of food through the digestive system is as follows. It begins in the mouth, then it travels down a long tube called the esophagus to the stomach. Then it sits in the stomach for a while, and we'll discuss later today what the stomach does. And then it passes into the small intestine, and then into the large intestine, which is also known as the colon. And then from there, it is eliminated as feces. So what we want to do today is get a look at these parts and sort of figure out how to identify them, and then start to talk about how this whole process of digestion happens. Can you identify the four major organs of the digestive tract that I just outlined? The esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. And to situate you in this diagram, we are looking at a dorsal view. It's as if we're looking from behind at the viscera. The esophagus is this tube labeled with a 2 here. And the way you can tell it is because it passes into the stomach. So the esophagus goes from the throat or the mouth all the way down into the stomach. And so here now is the muscular stomach. In many organisms, it's kidney-shaped in a sense. It's muscular. We often draw it with this rugose or ridged inner lining, very muscular. So the stomach is number 5 or 6 here. That's the outside and the inside of the stomach. Then next it passes into the small intestine, which includes this part here, and then going to all of this stuff here. So it's a very long, thin tube. And the thinness in diameter of the tube is why it's called the small intestine. From here, food passes into the large intestine. And you can see here the large intestine first goes up, then it travels across, then it travels down, and then eventually we get to the rectum where feces is stored until it is eliminated. So the large intestine is referred to as large because of the much larger diameter that it has. This is a ventral view, and you can see how everything sits. Now, there are several organs that play an ancillary, helpful role in the digestion of food. Food doesn't pass through these organs, but digestion is aided by them, so we need to learn about them. The first is the liver. The liver is a large lobed organ, mainly on your right side, that produces bile. It does other things as well, as we will learn later, such as detoxifies toxins in the food. But it produces bile, and bile is going to be especially important in the digestion of fats, as we will see later on. Next, we have the gallbladder, and the gallbladder's entire job is to store the bile. So the bile gets produced in the liver and then stored in the gallbladder. And then finally we have the pancreas, which is associated with the other two, and it produces enzymes for digesting the food into building block molecules. And it also raises the pH of the food stream when it enters the intestine. So now we have the same diagram we saw earlier, the dorsal view of the viscera. And can you identify the liver the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Okay, let's figure this out. So the liver is a large lobe structure here, number 3, and you can see it right here. Then we have the pancreas, which is this gland-like structure right here. And then finally we have the gallbladder up sitting under the liver, and it is often a greenish black color, which is the color of bile. And so the bile is produced here, it is then stored here, and it is going to be released into the upper end of the small intestine to help with the digestion of fats that's going to occur in the whole rest of the small intestine. At this point, you should be able to recognize in a diagram the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, as well as the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. Let's talk for a second about the path of food and how it gets digested along the way. So we begin with the mouth, and the mouth is responsible for mastication, which means chewing. And chewing's entire purpose is to break the food into smaller and smaller pieces, thereby increasing the surface area. The mouth also introduces the first enzyme, an enzyme called amylase, and amylase is responsible for the digestion of starch. Starch is a polymer of glucose, which means it's a lot of glucoses strung together. So amylase allows the starch to be cut up into glucoses, and that means some of the first things you'll absorb in the digestive tract will be sugar. And it suggests that the procurement of energy has historically been the most important thing because it happens the fastest. The other thing that happens in the mouth is all that saliva wets the food, and it turns out that's going to be very important because we want to take our solid food and turn it into a liquid slurry so that the digestive enzymes will have lots of surfaces to work on. The esophagus, the next step, is just simply a tube to the stomach. Nothing else happens here. And so let's take a look at it. Here is somebody chewing. They've got a big lump of food that they're about to swallow. It's called a bolus, one of my favorite words. And when you swallow, the bolus flows down the esophagus. There's a little flap that covers over your trachea because you know you also breathe in through your mouth so that food doesn't get down into your lungs. And by a process called peristalsis, which is the sequential contractions of muscle in the esophagus, food gets forced down into the stomach. Now let us go on and look at what happens in the stomach. Once the food reaches the stomach, 3 things are going to happen. First, the pH is drastically lowered as hydrochloric acid is added to the food. This has a number of important effects. 1, it sterilizes the food, kills almost all the bacteria. 2, it denatures proteins, and so that means it unfolds them. And that makes it a lot easier for enzymes to pull them apart and turn them into amino acids. And 3, the hydrochloric acid would normally damage the cells on the lining of the stomach. But we have an adaptation to deal with that as we cover those cells in mucus, and that protects the cells of the stomach. The second thing that's going to happen to the food when it reaches the stomach is that chemical digestion will continue because the enzyme pepsin is added to the food, and pepsin digests proteins. So we get the beginning of protein digestion. In addition, we have mechanical breakdown occurring in the stomach. The stomach is very muscular and it massages the food, constantly massages the food into a slurry. So what's a slurry, you might ask? A slurry is a liquid with solid particles suspended within it. And the name of the slurry is chyme. So the stomach massages with its muscles the food into chyme. There are several common pathologies with the stomach, and I'll just mention them here. The first is heartburn, which literally feels like a burning sensation in your heart. Your heart is right here, and the top of your stomach is right behind it here. And so when acid splashes up into the esophagus doesn't like that and feels pain. Let's take a look at that. So here is a diagram of the stomach. Here's the esophagus coming into the stomach. And you'll notice that there's a muscle called a sphincter. It's the esophageal sphincter. It's well named. And that closes after the food passes through. That prevents acid from going up into the esophagus. But as you age, this sphincter tends to let acid up in, and people get acid indigestion. And there are certain foods and other substances we take in, notably caffeine and nicotine, that cause this sphincter not to work so well, and heartburn is the result. There's also a sphincter at the other end called the pyloric sphincter, which closes, and until the chyme is formed, it will not release the food into the beginning of the small intestine here. A second pathology is ulcer, and an ulcer occurs when the mucous membrane on the stomach breaks down and the acid starts to burn and damage the cells of the lining of the stomach. This is also something that certain kinds of human behavior enhances, particularly things like smoking and drinking alcohol will tend to increase the occurrence of ulcers. So that's it for today. Here's where we're at. We have seen that the digestive system has a goal of turning food into building block molecules. In order to do that, it has to first break the food up into small particles so that there's a lot of surface area. And then enzymes have to attack those surfaces and pull the building block molecules off and put them into the solution of food we call chyme. In tomorrow's video, we're going to look at what happens in the small and large intestine. And then we'll be done with the digestive system. Until then, go outside, look at nature, ask questions, bring them back to class, and I'll see you soon.